From the archives of my Shadowdelve research, I came across an interesting observation. I've noticed that certain stories seem to arrive at exactly that right moment in our lives, not necessarily because they're the greatest stories ever written, and not because everyone else loves them, but because somehow they speak to something we're experiencing at that particular point in time. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. Maybe it was a book, a movie, a conversation, or a quote you weren't looking for, but something that appeared almost unexpectedly and yet stayed with you long after everything else was forgotten. What I find fascinating about this is that if someone had shown you that exact same story 5 years earlier, you might have ignored it completely. The story didn't change, you changed. And think about it for a moment. How many things in life seem to work this way? A book can sit on a shelf for years. Thousands of people can walk past it, most never noticing it. But then one day, someone picks it up and feels as though it was written specifically for them. Yet the book was always there. So, what changed? Perhaps the story didn't suddenly become visible. Perhaps we became capable of seeing it. And that raises another question. How many opportunities have passed through our lives unnoticed simply because we weren't ready for them? Or how many lessons arrived before their time? How many answers were present before we understood the question? I sometimes wonder whether life operates this way more often than we realize. Not just with stories, but with people, with ideas, with experiences, even with challenges. Perhaps you've noticed them too. You meet someone, but nothing happens. Years later, you meet another person, and a simple conversation stays with you forever. Not because they said something extraordinary, but because they appeared at precisely the right moment. The timing gave those words weight. The timing allowed them to take root. And then there are those strange moments that are difficult to explain. Moments where you keep encountering the same idea, perhaps the same subject, the same book recommendation, the same conversation, even the same question, again and again, almost as if something is attempting to draw your attention towards it. Now, I'm not suggesting anything mystical. Perhaps it's simply awareness. Perhaps when something becomes important to us, we begin noticing it everywhere. But regardless of the reason, the experience itself remains fascinating because suddenly the world begins feeling interconnected. Patterns begin appearing, connections begin forming. Things that seemed random begin feeling meaningful. I've often wondered about this while writing. Do writers truly create stories, or do they uncover them? Do ideas originate entirely within us, or do they arrive when we're finally prepared to receive them? I don't really know. But I can tell you this: many of the ideas that I found, they made their way into Shadowdelve. They didn't arrive when I sat down and demanded them. They actually arrived unexpectedly during a walk, during a conversation, specifically during those quiet moments late in the afternoon or late at night, or during questions I couldn't stop thinking about. Almost as though the idea was waiting patiently until I was finally able to notice it. And perhaps creativity itself works this way. Perhaps understanding works this way as well. And perhaps growth works similar. Maybe the answers we seek are not always hidden. Maybe they're simply unnoticed. That is why certain stories remain with us, not because they changed us, but because they revealed something that was already there, something waiting quietly beneath the surface. Maybe stories are less like messages and more like mirrors, not showing us who we are, but showing us who we're becoming. And perhaps that is why years later we still remember them. Not because of the plot, not because of the characters, but because they arrived at the exact moment we needed them. Anyways, this was simply an observation I came across while working through some of my Shadowdelve research. Something I found interesting that I wanted to share with you. Why certain stories seem to find us at particular moments in our lives, whether that's a coincidence, timing, awareness, or something else entirely. I'm not really sure. But it's a question I found myself returning to more than once. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. Maybe there's a story you still think about years later. Maybe there's a book, a film, or even a conversation that appeared at precisely the right moment in your life. I'd actually be curious to hear about it. Conversations like these from the Shadowdelve Archives continue every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Pacific Time. Next week, we'll be exploring the psychology of fear and perception. And if there's a topic you'd like us to dive into together, let me know in the comments. But until next time, remember, the raven is always watching.